All right. Great. So thank you everyone for coming. My name is Brianna Last, and I'm the chair of the Political Education Committee of Philly DSA. Thanks for coming to our discussion on the book Trade Wars Are Class Wars. We're really excited to have one of the co-authors of the book, Matt Klein, here to discuss. Before I let Matt take it away, I want to offer some prefatory remarks about our discussion and then introduce our speaker. So this discussion is part of our Marxism and Politics lecture series. And the idea for this lecture series emerged a little over 2 years ago in the wake of remarkable political and ideological transformations in American politics. As the US entered its second Gilded Age and the political and economic illegitimacy of the system was laid bare, Bernie Sanders' twin presidential bids broadcast to a national audience that a more equitable and just society is possible. At the same time, in workplaces across the country, workers rediscovered the power of collective action. The resurgence of labor militancy and the immense enthusiasm for America's preeminent democratic socialists marked a sea change in political discourse. With these political developments, there's been a renewed intellectual interest in the socialist tradition, particularly Karl Marx's description of society as a class society. Through this lecture series, our organization has attempted to cultivate this re-energized intellectual activity by inviting academics and commentators from around the world, thinkers who've begun to seriously engage with questions of history and strategy. This lecture series has focused on questions of method. That is, how should those who seek to intervene in history go about analyzing and considering political situations? What are the kinds of questions we need to ask to make sense of past political struggles? And what are the generalizable lessons learned from history? And what are the particulars of our present social conditions? So we're delighted to have Matt Klein talk about his new book, co-authored with economist Michael Pettis, Trade Wars Are Class Wars. As the title suggests, the book argues that national trade policy is often a strategy by domestic elites to offload the problems of their highly unequal society onto other countries. Trade Wars Are Class Wars also shows that inequality distorts the global economy and threatens the survival of the open trading system. Matt Klein is an economics commentator at Barron's, and he's previously written for the Financial Times, Bloomberg, and The Economist. So the way that we're going to run this event is Matt is going to generously, with slides, provide just a broad overview of the book. Then I'm going to ask him a couple questions that I've prepared along with some folks who read the book together. And then we'll open it up to the audience. So as we're talking, please feel free to post questions in the chat, and I'll be sure to take note of them so that we can post them to Matt. So with that, Matt, please take it away.
Great, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Brianna. So as you said, there's going to be some slides, so hopefully this will be helpful and not distracting. This is the book. You know, the title, we really just wanted to put the thesis just as most straightforwardly out there as we could. You know, the idea being, you know, we started talking about doing this book basically the end of 2017, when obviously, you know, Trump having been elected and beginning to, you know, before actually really starting a lot of bellicose trade policy, but talking about it. And then as that went on, and we thought, you know, a lot of the discourse about this was really either people saying, oh, well, trade wars are great because they're, you know, Americans are getting screwed and we need to do something about it, or trade wars are stupid because they have nothing to do with anything. And our view is that this is actually, you know, both of these are wrong in just different, you know, distinct ways. And you know, this is just summarizing these, you know, the globalists who say that it doesn't, you know, there is literally impossible for, you know, things happening outside the United States to affect Americans, or things happening outside of any country to affect people inside those country, and people who say that obviously foreigners are blamed to everything, and both of those are wrong. And our view is you know, harkens back to the ideas of a British economist, social critic. You know, people talk about economy. You know, he wasn't an academic, but very keen observer of the world around him, John Hobson. And you know, this quote is a very good summary of his view, and it's essentially that he was trying to explain why you know, imperialism as it was practiced by Western Europeans at the turn of the 20th century was was taking place when it seemed to be that it wasn't actually beneficial to most people who live in those countries. And his insight was that even if it's not, particularly helpful to like the average Englishman or the average Frenchman or the average German, the people who have a lot of influence in those societies, the owners of, major manufacturing companies and so forth, the rich, in other words, they had, because of the structure of the society and the inequality in their societies, that trade, and in particular the colonial project, was very helpful to them sort of resolving their own domestic problems without leading to revolution. And the mechanics of that are somewhat complicated to explain, as we spent a lot of the book trying to do. And if these charts are, basically giving you a lot of the argument in if you kind of stare at them for a long time, which essentially is that the distribution of income actually has consequences for the economy in ways that I think a lot of people didn't really, they knew this at the time, back when Hobson was writing. He was provocative and sort of heterodox when he was saying this. People then appreciated it, and then it sort of got forgotten for a long time. And now I think it's sort of coming back into mainstream conversation. But for a long time, people didn't really appreciate this. And I think, and the reason is very simple, which is that this chart on the left is showing that people at the very, very top of the income distribution behave very differently than everyone else. That the vast majority of people over the course of their lives will spend essentially everything they earn. Maybe they'll save a lot when they're working and spend it down when they're retired or something like that. But in general, it all balances out. Businesses historically would actually spend more than they earned. I mean, in the past, the way it used to be was that businesses would, depend on savings from households to finance their investment. That's changed pretty recently. That's an interesting point we talk about in the book. And then you have the very rich, who, of course, essentially is just very hard, if you have that much income coming in on a regular basis, to continue to spend it all on goods and services, no matter how much expensive your tastes are. And what do you do with the difference is you're accumulating financial assets or real assets like housing or fine art, things like that. And what that means is that if you have a shift in the distribution of income, that ends up having, it changes the relative balance between people who spend on goods and services and people who buy financial assets. And one way that you can sort of reconcile this is what the chart on the left is showing, essentially, which is that you have an increase in indebtedness. That sort of, to oversimplify a little bit, but not that much. Very, very rich people, if their incomes stay high, but they're not spending it, then that means that they are somehow effectively lending to everyone else to buy things from them. So another way of thinking about this is that, an individual company might be able to, cut its wage bill and to boost its profit margin. But if every company does that, that doesn't work, because workers collectively are all, consumers. So you have to have debt to make this difference, make those things add up. And so we've seen, in fact, in the United States, and you can see similar charts for other countries. That's a chart I made for the US data, but that you see a sharp increase in concentration of income at the very, very top, coinciding with a very significant increase in indebtedness of households and governments. And this is an unstable situation, particularly if it's household debt, which is what you saw a lot in the United States. And the point of our book is essentially this is what's happened at a global level, and that the trade conflict element is sort of just a layer on top, which is that these imbalances of debt and income and spending and saving don't have to be confined to one country. That, in fact, what you can see in a lot of times is that, in one society, you might have an increase in inequality, and then instead of that, the consumers of the society taking out debt to afford to buy the things they no longer could afford in the past, then instead it's consumers in other societies that do that. And, that shows up as a trade imbalance. And, our point is that that's why, you need to look at the global economy and global financial system as a whole, as a unified system, because otherwise, you look at, what happened. So for example, in say Spain in the financial crisis, if you look at Spain in isolation without understanding what was going on in the rest of Europe, particularly in Germany, you won't really understand or have any good explanation. Or for that matter, if you look at the U.S., financial crisis, you won't understand why things happened there the way they did unless you're also understanding what was going on in other parts of the world, particularly China, but not exclusively China. And we're trying to explain how these things fit together and why inequality is so important in explaining the dynamics we've seen over the past several decades. And so a lot of the book is focused basically on in particular, events since 1989. I mean, we talked about some things before that, but it's really, that's sort of in many ways a really interesting turning point, because it happens to be a very big, significant year for both China and for Germany in very different ways. But the net effect in many ways ended up being the same, which is that you had a big transfer of purchasing power away from ordinary people towards businesses and the rich, and that had all sorts of other consequences, both for the people who live in those countries and then for the rest of the world. So, talking about in China, I mean, what the short version here is that you have a very, very long period of time, going back, well over 100 years of China, being basically either under varying forms of foreign occupation or civil war, or revolution or Maoism, and basically the long period of being impoverished either by foreigners or by their own internal instability. You get to 1978, that finally changes, and you have this really big burst of productivity and development as Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues basically liberalize. A lot of the rural economy, and basically farmers, they still have to sell a certain amount to the government at sort of controlled prices that and the food's distributed to the city, but anything beyond that they can sell at market prices, and then they have a surplus they can invest and increase, and end up moving into sort of small scale manufacturing, things like that, and that ends up leading to really impressive gains in the economy and for the well-being of hundreds of millions of Chinese people. Unfortunately, it ended up being unstable insofar as the urban industrial economy did not have the same level of liberalization. And so what ended up happening is you get through the 1980s is, among other things, that food prices rise very dramatically. And so for some people in cities, you're not actually seeing the kind of increase in living standards that people had come to expect. And that leads to a degree of instability, combined with the fact that there was this political liberalization going on at the same time, and there was a lot of ambiguity about, how far that process could go. You end up with protests, the pro-democracy movement and protests, they're protests in 1987 that don't end in the same way as the ones in 89. But by the time you get to 1989, you actually have a really significant threat to the regime. It's often portrayed as being, basically spoiled college kids in Beijing. That, I mean, that's how like the CCP would portray it. But in fact, this was actually, very broad based. There were farmers, there were, the urban proletariat. They were all involved in this, and that's why the party was so terrified of what was going on, and crushed it so violently. And in response, the immediate initial response was sort of to discredit the reformist tendencies of Deng Xiaoping and the others who were with him, and that basically they tried to roll back some of the reforms, and that actually led to basically the first like real economic downturn that China's had basically in that from '78 until now. And it didn't work, and they ended up discrediting themselves. Deng ends up coming back in '92. What the decision that they make then is that there has to be a difference in the way that the Chinese economy grows, so that the pattern of just liberalizing and letting people just improve their own livelihoods, as was done through most of the '80s, would no longer be acceptable. That instead, the compromise was that the party would have to be in charge to a very high degree of the economy. And what they did, they took advantage of an insight from the Hungarian economist Janos Kornai, which is that you can have the framework of a Leninist political system, and capture many of the benefits of market-based, competitive, you could call it capitalist or whatever society, as long as essentially the party and its people are in charge of all the businesses that are competing with each other. And that's essentially what ended up happening. And ironically, what this meant was that you had a situation where where the Chinese party state was actively encouraging a really sharp increase in inequality and a very dramatic concentration of income and spending power, as regular people had their incomes essentially redirected to politically supported businesses that would then spend on making investments that the government wanted. And this was actually worked out okay for most people throughout, certainly through the 1990s, because, as I mentioned, China had been so impoverished for so long that even if this isn't necessarily the most efficient way of doing things, or fair way of doing things, that really any investment that you could get done would end up boosting productivity and living standards very quickly. And so essentially you can think of it as a successful version of trickle down economics of, yes, people, the share of income that was going to workers was falling pretty quickly, which you can see essentially in this black line. That's why household spending, the Chinese economy initially, in the 1980s, about half of everything the Chinese economy produced went to consumers, and then that fell pretty steadily, and it hit the low point of like 35%, which is extraordinarily low. You basically don't see that in any kind of large diversified economy. You only see that kind of number in, like, say, Soviet Union under Stalin, or a corporate tax haven where the numbers are kind of distorted, or like an oil sheikdom. But that happened because the government was basically saying, no, households are not going to be getting money. We're going to transfer that to businesses. We're going to transfer that to provincial governments, and they're going to be doing things. And some of those things might be valuable, like building a high-speed rail line from say Beijing to Shanghai. But some of those things are not valuable, like building apartment blocks in the middle of nowhere that people don't need or can use. And this is in the context of even though China is much richer now, I mean, you still have rural poverty affecting hundreds of millions of people, and lower quality healthcare and things like that. So it's a question of the priorities. But the flip side of this is, you can see in the blue line, if households are consuming less, but businesses are still producing more, it has to be going somewhere. So some of that went into this fixed investment that like I was just talking about, and some of it went into the trade side of things. That was how it was reconciled. So China was importing more stuff. Chinese households and businesses are importing more things than the rest of the world. They were also exporting even more, and that ended up showing up as a pretty dramatic increase in the trade surplus. Um, and that's essentially, in other words, China's internal, decisions of Chinese political leaders, sort of summing up a reaction in 1989 and thinking about how they can maintain their own political hegemony, and also, have the economy growing quickly enough that there's some legitimacy, that ends up leading this kind of economic model. It's not a model that China invented, but it's a model that they've ended up implementing in a way that you haven't really seen anywhere else in any kind of, certainly, economy of this size. And one of the consequences of this, which goes back to what I was showing before, is that you have debt increasing. And so debt increased initially outside of China, really predominantly in the form of trade imbalances, particularly in the United States. But then after the global financial crisis, that is no longer possible. And so what ends up happening is that, after 2008 or so, Chinese leaders basically do, in many ways, you just sort of, good macro management in a sense, which is, okay, like if you lose your export markets, you should increase your own domestic spending by Chinese people. That creates demand for your businesses, so unemployment doesn't go up. So they do that, and so in that narrow sense, it works. But the problem is, instead of encouraging more household consumption and allowing Chinese living standards to really dramatically increase, they basically sort of double down on this model of even more unproductive and wasteful investment. And so the consequence there is just this massive increase in indebtedness within China, basically to the pace of it and the size of it. Again, like, there's really no precedent for it. And basically you get to sort of 2012, 2013, they conclude that they need to sort of change things, and that's why you see that line. A, China's growth starts slowing down pretty dramatically, and B, these lines sort of flatten out until you get to the coronavirus. But that ends up then creating new problems, because there's a question of, okay, if your domestic market is not growing, you still have the problems you did before. And I think, we talk about Belt and Road Initiative. There's a lot of, that China's sort of, you can think of it as like financial, boost to trying to engage in development in, the global South. I think part of that is a function of, like, how can you create new export markets to sort of offset the loss of both your traditional export markets, and because Europe and the US aren't growing as quickly as they were, and sort of the saturation of your own domestic investment space. And then, in some ways that really fits in again with this, sort of the Hobsonian theme of colonial, not that BRI was strictly colonialism in that sense, but everything's sort of a little different. But you can think of that as an analogy of, okay, well, you have to find a new market somewhere. That was sort of Hobson's point. The other big surplus economy we talk about in the book is Germany, which then ends up becoming, sort of Europe as a whole, as the German government effectively imposes its will on its neighbors. And the really important point, that there's a lot of points that we make in this section of the book, but I think a really important one, just at the basic level, is that the reason that Germany has had this huge trade surplus for the past 15, 20 years or so, is not because German exports are particularly good. It's not that German exports are bad. I mean, I have a Miele vacuum cleaner and it's fantastic, but it's that imports from Germans were so weak. and that basically the German domestic economy was so weak, that business investment was very weak, that household consumption was very weak, that the government spending was extremely weak, that that is the reason why the surplus has been large. That basically you have about a quarter to a third of the German economy. Um, Basically, they're companies that just sell things to the rest of the world, and so their sales are going to grow more or less in line with the global economy. But if those companies, are deciding, and other companies are deciding they're not going to be paying workers much, if the government is deciding that it's not going to be spending to make investments in infrastructure, and instead is going to be raising taxes on people and cutting welfare benefits and so forth, then the net effect of that is going to be that the German domestic market is not going to grow as quickly as the rest of the world, and you're going to have this big imbalance. And that's essentially what we're seeing with these two lines, where German GDP is not growing particularly rapidly, during the period when its trade surplus is rising. Certainly, in fact, compared to the 1990s, it was a different story. But the domestic economy is even worse, and that's where the trade surplus comes from. Which again, sort of fitting in with the overall picture we're the story we're telling in the book. I mean, it's in China you have the domestic economy growing rapidly, but production is growing even more quickly, and then that shows up as basically exports that are dumped, if you will, or sold at with very very sort of artificially cheap financing to the rest of the world. In Germany, it's just the domestic economy is not growing well at all. Businesses are chugging along, and that leads to some balance. And again, the beneficiaries of this. Um, German companies in particular, and which are predominantly, family owned by very, very rich, the small, tiny fraction of the population, they basically just increase their profitability massively. And what do? That they end up putting it in German banks that then lend to the rest of the world. A lot of those loans end up turning out poorly. This is not really good for anybody. Certainly not good for the vast majority of people who live in Germany. Another point I think that a lot of people get wrong about Germany, which we wanted to, sort of following on what I was just saying, is that the idea of the sort of German jobs miracle that has occurred basically since 2005, which the unemployment rate in Germany fell from 13% or whatever to well below 5%, on the eve of the coronavirus, almost continuously, and the unemployment rate did not go up during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and it, continued to drop. And the view was, oh, well, they figured something out, and the rest of Europe should be like this, high unemployment in places like Italy and Spain and Greece, like if only they learned like Germany. And this is some context for like what actually happened there. There are other ways of showing this general point, but basically the reason that unemployment fell was because the German government cut unemployment benefits to the point that a lot of people who were sort of scraping by, maybe they lost their job in like their 50s or something, were just kind of waiting until they could collect Social Security. Then they had to take some, low-paid part-time job, like a sweeping something or being a janitor, what have you, because that was, there's no other way for them to get money. And so one consequence of this is that household income basically was flat for a very, very long time, or falling. But the German government budget was doing better because they were saying, oh, we're not spending as much on welfare payments, but overall living standards were not improving. And you can another way you could look at this is the share of people who are working, of Germans who are working. The big increase is basically from like people. It was basically like women age 55 to 65 was like the big increase. It's not people sort of core working age that were suddenly working a lot more, um, which again suggests that this was not necessarily the kind of thing you'd want to necessarily emulate. But in fact, other European countries, when they were pushed, they ended up having similar results. And in fact, that's the last point here. But Germany's impact on the rest of the world was initially somewhat hidden by the fact that if you look at Europe as a whole, or the euro area, all the countries that use the euro as a currency, that the rise of the German surplus is basically offset internally by the rise of the deficits in places like Spain and Greece and Portugal and Ireland and Italy. And one way of looking at this, just straightforward, is, I mean, Spain is a great counterexample, right? The Spanish economy is doing very well. They were producing a lot of things, but that Spanish consumers and businesses were, spending even more. And some of that stuff was worthwhile. I mean, Spain built out this fantastic network of high-speed rail lines. There's a lot of nice resorts that were built up on the on the Mediterranean coast. But then they also ended up, sort of famously, there was this Don Quixote airport built, basically 2 hours from anything in the middle of nowhere in Spain. And I think it opened in like 2009 or something. This was sort of billion euros wasted. So that was sort of like the offsetting fact, balancing out of what was going on in Germany. But then you have the euro crisis, and what happens is that suddenly the German lenders that had been providing financing um, to these other European countries that were sort of offsetting it, basically they cut back. They lost too much money and they weren't able to continue to do that. And so spending in those countries ends up falling pretty dramatically. There's no offsetting increase in spending in Germany. And so you end up having this, the German trade surplus becomes sort of the European trade surplus writ large. You have this massive declines in Spanish and Italian and Greek and Portuguese and so forth. Consumption, investment, households, living standards fall very dramatically. Infrastructure spending basically goes negative if you subtract depreciation. Businesses cut their investment pretty dramatically, and everyone's just end up worse off. And then who's the counterpart? Well, basically everyone who sold to Europe in the past, their customer base is smaller. Um, and European businesses, except they're doing better, it's also, they're basically, I guess, effectively taking, if you think of the global demand having shrunk because Europeans are spending less, then, European businesses essentially sort of taking market share a bit from everyone else, and they're creating, this unneeded um, fight over market share when, total demand is weaker than otherwise should have been. On the other side of this, of all these things, is the United States. And, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but essentially, if, you have some places that are producing not necessarily too much, but at least producing more than they're absorbing domestically because their own domestic economy, their various institutional and structural things and choices that deprive households in particular of spending on things that they want, someone else somewhere in the world has to be balancing that out, and they have to be doing that by borrowing. And the U.S. is the biggest example. It's not the only one. In general, it's like sort of the English-speaking countries as a whole: the U.S., the U.K., Canada, Australia. But the U.S. is the biggest one, and there are a couple ways of looking at this. One that's sort of pretty striking is that if you look at American demand for durable goods, which is a big category, it could be like a laptop, it could be a piece of furniture, but things that are in general, you could think of it sort of broadly as sort of like higher value manufacturing goods, basically used to rise in line with production of those goods. That's the chart on the left. And then you get to around 2000, that's not what happens. And it's not because, Americans still want more stuff, but they're suddenly making less. And, it's not that they can't make more. There's no capacity constraint. It's just that, A, there's a lot of cheaper stuff coming in that isn't, there's no sort of demand for American made, um, that basically is sort of displacing American domestic production. And also, this is the really key point: demand in the rest of the world isn't rising to offset that. Like, what normally should happen is if you have sort of like someone somewhere else is making something cheaper than you can make it, they sell it to you, then you say, okay, well, maybe I can't make that thing anymore, but they have more money now because they're, getting it, because I'm selling stuff to them, so they can buy more stuff, and sooner or later it's going to come back to me one way or another. Maybe not directly, maybe they'll buy something from, a third party or whatever, but that's normally how things should work. You can see this in the 1990s in the US where, the basically extinction of the U.S. textile industry, obviously very traumatic for the people who work in it, but overall U.S. manufacturing production, the U.S. economy is going quite well, and in fact the global economy is rising quite dramatically. In the 2000s is a very different story, and that's a reflection of the fact that the global demand for goods and services is insufficient to meet global production, to absorb all the stuff that's being produced. And the chart on the right is basically showing how who ends up sort of paying for that over time. And it's basically, you think about like a trade imbalance or whatever, you can break it down. There are a lot of ways of breaking it down, but like you can look at like the government, you look at businesses, you look at households. And in the US, you can see that it kind of shifts back and forth of what's driving it. But I think that the key point here is that yeah, you talk to some people, maybe this doesn't come up in this group, but like they'll say, oh, well, the trade deficit is because the government spends too much or something like that. And it's like, that's not really right. I mean, usually if the government is borrowing more, the U.S. government's borrowing more, then that's sort of offset by higher saving or higher profits, either by households and businesses. Conversely, some of the times when the U.S. trade deficit has been very large, it's because you have U.S. businesses are sort of investing way more than they're earning, like in the late 1990s, or you have things like the housing bubble in the 2000s. But either way, like it's determined outside the United States, which I guess is the key point here, that ultimately, if you want to understand like why does the U.S. have a trade deficit, you have to look, just as you have to understand like why other countries have the various trade and financial imbalances that they do. You have to look at the global system, and as we try to explain, in this case, it's really a function of the fact that globally, too many people in the rest of the world are not able to afford to buy the things that they're making. And that, in particular, we talk about, China and Europe. That's where, those are the biggest contributors, but, a lot of the phenomena we describe apply to other cases as well. And of course, they also apply, to a degree within the United States, of course, which also, has seen a big increase in inequality in the past couple decades. Um, but in some, but of course, but, not to be too detailed, but that's been offset by the big increase in household indebtedness that occurred, at least until, 2008. That's basically the gist of the book. Hopefully that wasn't too, in the weeds here, and certainly, look forward to taking your questions, all this stuff. So thank you.
Thanks, Matt. That was really helpful. And I loved the graphs. I thought they were very illustrative. You started your talk by talking about the kind of like wrongs, like the things that people just really misunderstand about global trade. And part of it stems from, disingenuous political rhetoric. But also, one of the other things that you mention in the book um, is just how all of our measurements are really off, and how people are cooking the books. And there are really creative ways, as you say, that taxation is recorded. Can you speak a little bit to that and how that's really distorting our understanding of what's going on?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things that comes up, there are a couple layers there. So, I mean, one of the basic ones, Trump, for example, talked about the trade deficit with China being so important. And our point is that, you know, the trade deficit between any two countries doesn't really make it much of a difference. That, again, like the global system is what matters. And in fact, what you can see very clearly is that when there were tariffs put on imports from China, unsurprisingly, the US trade deficit with China shrank. But the trade deficit with the rest of the world rose more than enough to offset that. In fact, the overall trade balance is completely smooth. You can't see any impact whatsoever. In fact, you can find lots of news reports that basically show that a lot of businesses essentially rerouted production, or they just chose to have something imported, basically a layer through some other country to get around those tariffs. And so that's a very sort of straightforward example. There are other examples that we mentioned in the book. You have ports, certain things can distort. It's like, for example, the port of Antwerp and the port of Rotterdam are like two of the biggest ports in Europe, and like a lot of American exports to Europe will land in those ports, which leads to the sort of weird consequence that like U.S. exports to Belgium and the Netherlands are enormous relative to U.S. exports to say like France and Germany and Italy, which are obviously much larger countries, much bigger economies. So you see the same thing in Asia with like Hong Kong and Singapore, where again U.S. exports to those places are much, 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 much larger than are justified by their population or market size. On the other hand, like you have to reasonably think that exports that otherwise that we don't record going to like the rest of Southeast Asia or Japan or China probably are being routed through there. So like you have to, focusing on these sort of bilateral relationships can really be confusing if you're not you're not being careful about what you're looking at. And then there's the whole tax dimension, which is another angle, which is I think really interesting in terms of just interpreting the statistics. So if you look at the U.S., one of the like the countries that the U.S. is one of the biggest trading and investment relationships with in the world is Ireland. Um, which, I mean, yes, obviously there are a lot of like Irish Americans and they speak English, and so you can imagine there's things going on there that are sort of fundamental, but that's not really the reason. I mean, it's a country of like 5 million people. The real reason is the fact that it's a very attractive corporate tax haven, and basically every big software company and pharma company and other, I mean, those are the main ones, but like other sector industries as well use Ireland as a corporate tax base for their sales, not just to Europe, but really to the rest of the world to avoid U.S. taxation. And that leads to some really weird, interesting phenomena. So one thing that shows up is that you have an enormous amount of imports of pharmaceuticals from Ireland into the U.S. You also have massive reporting profits from Ireland, like basically American subsidiaries in Ireland are like the most profitable of like any place in the world. It's a fascinating phenomenon, but that's not representing a real economic relationship. Now the good news is that in general, if you're looking at what's called the current account balance, which basically is the trade, relationships that are sort of measured by the census and stuff, but also things like profits earned by foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies and like remittances and stuff like that. If you add all that stuff up in the current account, that gives you a more realistic picture of what's going on. So that, for example, you know, the exports that Apple is doing iOS when an iPhone is sold in Europe, whatever, may not show up as exports of software from the US. Like US doesn't actually export much software officially, but on the other hand, like Apple and Microsoft and Google and Facebook and stuff reporting these huge profits in these offshore centers, and so that will get counted in the current account. So it's useful to have that as some perspective, and also like just understanding how the global system works. Of course, one other corollary here is that the fact that you have these very hyper profitable companies becoming even more profitable through taxation sort of exacerbates the problems that we talk about in the book, in the sense that the people who are getting that money and the businesses that are retaining those earnings are not spending them on goods and services. They're not paying people who would be spending goods and services. And that sort of exacerbates the overall problem of underconsumption, and makes everything worse for everybody.
Yeah, that I was really shocked by those statistics. And then also just looking at sort of like patent law and the way that certain countries like own patents. That was uh, very enlightening. Um, I guess I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about uh, your focus on developmental models in the book, and you talked about this in terms of China and how it's thought about its development. One of the central theses is that like the way that countries develop and the economic policies that they employ aren't necessarily the same economic policies that they should continue to employ if they're already developed. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and, why, for instance, like in China, investing in anything was okay, even if it wasn't like particularly efficient initially, but now it's just sort of like being thrown in their faces a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so as you're saying, like one of the things we talk about a lot in the book is that the way that countries industrialize and modernize, it requires something that looks unbalanced. That basically, if you're a poor agrarian society, you cannot become rich unless you somehow are able to get a lot of stuff from more technologically advanced societies. And either you can, at one extreme, you can do sort of the Stalinist approach of you just starve your own peasants by and export things and barter with the Nazis for advanced machinery, or you can do some, you can basically borrow from the rest of the world and say, like, if you invest in us, in our development, you will prosper and we'll pay you back, which is essentially what the US did, and it's what a lot of other countries did. I mean, this is South Korea developed and stuff. But either way, it's going to lead to some, really interesting implications for your society and for the rest of the world. And as you say, like what makes sense at a point in time doesn't necessarily work elsewhere. I mean, the thing about what China has been doing, and following along the path of, say, Japan or Brazil sort of tried it, moderate successes. There can, when you're a very, very poor society, and particularly a poor society like China, where it just, there was, even for being poor, there was just not much investment because there've been so much war and revolution, or quite frankly, if you're rebuilding after having lost a war. I mean, you can look at, say, Korea after 1953, right? I mean, basically, there was nothing, everything had been flattened there. That there's a lot of stuff that's very obvious what you need to do to rebuild. This was also the case in Europe after World War II. Rebuild, it's very clear what kind of things you need, and so anything you can do to increase investment. I mean, obviously focusing on doing the most productive stuff first is helpful, but like really anything you might plausibly come up with is useful. But then for most societies, that's not really helpful. I mean, you pass a certain point pretty quickly. It sort of depends when for the society, but there, what is a good opportunity for investment? And it's a bit, what markets are supposed to do is basically like matching, people talk about like hurdle rates or whatever. It's supposed to be the case that if there is a good investment, you'll want to take it, and if it's not, attractive, best use of money, then you'll try to do something else with it. That might be, buying, consuming it, right? I mean, arguably, like just to digress slightly, like interest rates being very, very low for the past, decade plus, right? That is a market signal that, you know, saving and trying to invest in stuff is not the most economically useful thing for society. That like actually people should just be spending more in the aggregate. Like not every individual person. There are plenty of individual people who would be benefiting from saving more, but like in the aggregate, that's what it means. Um, and so that's an example of like how these things are sort of supposed to work. And what happened in China, one of the things that actually the government did very consciously was through the control of the banking system and financial regulation, was basically have interest rates be extremely low relative to what they otherwise would have been, and essentially that turbocharge investment at the expense of Chinese people who really had the only thing they could do if they had any money was put it in a bank deposit that was earning nothing. Um, and that worked for a while, but then, if you have the sort of, if anything is economically attractive for, whoever is able, privileged enough to get access to this borrowing, because, the banks sort of controlled that, then you're not going to necessarily get the most useful things. And as we said, then you end up with increasingly wasteful investment. That's not a problem unique to China. I mean, you should sort of draw an interesting analogy to the US, or for that matter, sort of the European crisis countries in the 2000s, where even though this was not a deliberate policy in either of those societies, but sort of as a consequence of things happening elsewhere, the cost of financing in the US was very, very low. And one of the things that ended up happening was you just had this, people build houses in places they did not need, among other things. Um, and or you look at in Spain, I mentioned that that airport, or like Greece just buying a bunch of submarines, the Greek government buying a bunch of submarines that were just not, I mean, maybe they needed it, but like it ended up being very problematic for them later on. And so, but it's a natural reaction to just having too much money thrown. I mean, one of the examples we talk about, which sort of relates to this, is at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the new German Empire got this huge payment from France, and they thought this was going to be a great opportunity for them to you know improve their modernization, build their military, stuff like that. And like a lot of it got wasted very quickly. And in fact, you look by the end of the 1870s, and a lot of people were saying within Germany that they should try to give the money back. And it's sort of, societies can only, I guess there's only so many useful opportunities at a time. Like if we think about like, what is the financial sector supposed to do? What are people, business supposed to be doing? Like it's trying to find the good investment opportunities and avoiding the bad ones. And that's supposed to be that's hard. Um, People don't always do it correctly, but like that sort of fits in it. And so if you just sort of turn off even attempting to try, then you can end up with a lot of bad results.
Thank you. That was helpful. I also just want to remind people that if you have questions, please put them in the chat, but I'll go full steam ahead. I mean, one of the things you mentioned just now that I thought was interesting was, you talk about kind of Stalin and the way that, authoritarianism was sort of useful in insofar as it exploited the peasantry. Um, but looking at some of the developmental models that you describe, like the US and China, like in the US, there was, of course, also extra economic coercion. There was slavery that was crucial to its developmental model. And then in China, labor unions are illegal. And then also, you discuss this hukou system, which I don't know
Mhm.
if I'm pronouncing correctly. Can you talk about that system and how it's also artificially suppressing wages?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I mean, labor repression, however it's done, is like a very common feature of industrialization. I mean, there's some places that did a better job of avoiding it, like Japan, but yeah, it's very common. Um, Whether it's slavery or serfdom, or in China, this household registration system, which was originally invented under Mao, and the basic idea was that so the way it works is that it was originally that people can't leave the village they're from. It was very like you had like a registration card, and there were basically internal mobility restrictions. And the basic argument for that was that they thought, well, we were able to take over the country as the Communist Party by getting a huge mass of disaffected people who supported us from different parts of the country, and then creating a sort of unified army, and then going to places we could take over, and then sort of gradually expanding a base. So we don't want to have that happen, and so therefore we're going to prevent people from coalescing and moving from wherever they are. And over time, those mobility restrictions are removed, but um, what's maintained is the idea that all the benefits you get from the government are tied to your registration. So you have this huge wave of migrants from the countryside to the cities, which is a very positive development for those people and helps with China's industrialization. You can think about what happened in England in the Industrial Revolution. It's a similar thing, but those people basically don't have rights. I mean, people in China don't really have rights the way we think of it anyway, but like these people have even less. Because in theory, they're sort of like illegal immigrants in like wherever city they are. They could always get deported. And in fact, actually, one of the things that happened shortly before, the coronavirus was like Beijing and Shanghai. People were complaining about how they're overcrowded, and the government's putting in population caps, and then basically like deporting people. And like they sort of said, oh, this neighborhood isn't very clean, so we're gonna have to like demolish it all of a sudden. Everyone leaves, but I mean, essentially, they're just evicting people like this, and so. Um, that being a threat obviously affects your ability to be aggressive in bargaining, but also like things like healthcare benefits and education and access to, certain kinds of housing and stuff. Like these are things that in principle the Chinese government does provide, but there's all done at sort of the provincial or local municipal level. And if you don't have the registration, then you can't get it. And so, you're basically have a lot of people, hundreds of millions of people who are paying, their social security taxes to get, so like the education system in the coastal cities, and then they're not getting anything. And they also know unemployment insurance. So one of the things we saw with the coronavirus is that um, when all these people lost their job, or not, many of these people lost their jobs, right? Like they couldn't stay in the cities and get unemployment. In fact, the government was quite happy the fact that everyone just dispersed. They went to the countryside because that's the only thing they could do. They basically became subsistence farmers, and that I guess had a salutary political effect for them. In sort of reducing instability, you could argue, but like it also is not good for their material standards of living, and it's not optimal. Like they're paying the taxes to support the unemployment insurance system. So this is probably like the number one thing that we would say should be fixed. And interestingly, this is something that like the Chinese leadership has repeatedly said that they think should fix, but also have not done anything to change it. I mean, the Chinese political system is more complex than like dictator at the top. There's, the power of the provinces is quite substantial. So there's an element of that there. I mean, I'm not a Chinese politics expert, but that like the sense of I've read this stuff. I mean, that's like a big reason why there haven't been progress on this. But that's in a nutshell, like how this stuff works.
That's a really great segue actually into a question that was put in the chat. So there were sort of two related questions. What sort of trade or domestic policy recommendations would you have to reduce wealth inequality? And then what are some of the benefits to global trade that domestic reductions in inequality would, address?
Sure. So for the first question, um, I think using trade policy to address inequality is sort of, I mean, that could work insofar as like we're talking about like the tax avoidance things like that. But I think in general, in some ways, it's like this is the reverse. Like the trade problems that people have in general. I mean, this is sort of one of the big arguments of our book. In general, those trade problems are a consequence of the domestic problems that are in various societies. And so if you fix those domestic problems, then that will fix the trade policy, which I guess, sort of gets the second question. I mean, what are the basic things that we would like to see happen? I mean, in a nutshell, if our sort of overall analysis is that there's the distribution of income globally is skewed, and that what that has done is led to basically not enough demand for goods and services relative to what's being produced. So really anything you can do to reverse that would be beneficial. And in particular, obviously in the places that where it's most extreme and where in particular it's showing up as like big trade surpluses. So for example, in China, if you improve, if you whether the Chinese government want to do this, but you have adversarial labor unions and you remove the hukou system and you can improve environmental regulation and you create more of a social safety net with things like healthcare and unemployment benefits and retirement security, which don't exist there. That would be all very helpful things. In talking about in Europe and in Germany in particular, there are a lot of self-imposed restrictions on government borrowing and government investment spending. You could fix those. You could lower value-added tax rates to make it easier for consumers to spend. You can roll back some of the changes that were done to reduce welfare programs in those countries. Certainly plenty of room for things in the United States as well. Obviously, one of the points we make that's sort of a trade-off is if the U.S. were to kind of unilaterally do this stuff, which would be good for people in the U.S. And good for the world for that matter, but there would be a cost though, which is that there would be a commensurate increase in indebtedness in the U.S. somewhere. Now, because basically if we're the ones who basically doing all the extra spending and no one else is, then there's that's going to make into an even a relatively larger trade deficit. That's not necessarily inherently a problem, but again though, if it's leading to like rising debt, then that can be an issue. And so the question is like, how do you channel that constructively? And also, of course, you're leaving behind all the people in the rest of the world who should be having their own improved living standards. So I guess, yeah, that'd be the sort of my main answer to that.
I was thinking about the challenges of that, considering how in the book you discuss how elites in countries control or determine trade policy, and then as you say, it's sort of a vicious cycle because then they benefit from it, which further entrenches their political power and wealth. And so they're certainly they can sort of control the strings and the power and the purse of government in many ways. So, who do you see as the agent of change, given that? I mean, in the book, you mentioned that labor unions should exist in China, but your perspective on labor unions in the U.S. is a little different. And so, I'm kind of curious about who you think the agent of change is in the U.S. And maybe Europe as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's tricky because I mean, what you see is that even in societies that don't actively ban labor unions, um, no one will go for, I mean, I don't think anyone goes to prison in the United States for trying to organize workers, or in Europe for that matter. But nevertheless, the power of labor unions, both in terms of membership or anything else, has declined quite dramatically across all societies. It's not just, a US phenomenon. I mean, in Germany, I was really surprised when I was looking at this for doing research on that section. You basically have this massive collapse starting in sort of the mid 1990s. And I don't know, to be honest, how you would reverse that or what, is the coalition of people that you would get to change this. I mean, the thing that is sort of the optimistic perspective is that it's not really good for, I mean, many of the people who are pursuing policies that individually they think are good for them that leaves these imbalances. I think if they had sort of a sense of what the total impact of this was, it's not necessarily good for them. Rather, they might think, like, you know, improving my profit margins by cutting wages or what have you, and like I don't want to have the government spending more on welfare is that's all good for you. They might think it's good for them, but like it might be a case where it's like, oh well, actually this is like reducing the total size of the markets and stuff you can sell to, and so you're basically getting a larger share of a smaller pie, and you might be better off with something that looks a little different. So that's possible. I don't know if that's how, I mean, I think like in practice, you probably would need some kind of buy-in from some people. I don't know, but like I'm not a politics expert to be honest. So like I don't. It's a great question. I mean, this is a question that's been asked before, so it's I don't have a great answer for you. I mean, I think there are some like sort of hints of things you see in like quite frankly in the U.S. recently and in Europe recently that are encouraging that people are sort of internalizing these things more. That like it does suggest that there's some people who just legitimately haven't thought of it this way. Um, but yeah, otherwise I don't know. It's kind of tricky. And of course, looking at it in a country like China, it's much trickier because it's not clear how they would do that or who would want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in response to the pandemic, there has been some effort to stimulate demand in the US. So that may be some modicum of promise.
Yeah, I mean, and Europeans like they created this thing to where they could basically get around some of the borrowing limits they'd imposed upon themselves. Again, it's very small, but like it's kind of encouraging. And like you look at the things like individual people are saying, and there seems to be a growing recognition. I mean, again, like we'll see like what actually happens, but yeah, I mean the potential is there. I mean, the good news is this is all essentially self-imposed. Bad news is if it's self-imposed and hasn't been fixed, then like that suggests that there's some pretty powerful reasons why. So yeah, there's sort of optimistic and pessimistic interpretations. I don't really have a great answer for you.
Yeah, well, we don't have the answers either. I just speaking of that, um, I was kind of curious about, you end the book a little bit about trade deals, and Trump made a very big deal of the fact that he was going to not sign the TPP. Can you talk a little bit about like trade agreements and who benefits from them and why the sort of political discourse of not signing them is appealing?
Yeah, so it's kind of fun. Like like one of the sort of the themes of our book is that a lot of things that people think about as like trade policy don't actually have a big impact on trade, and that things that people don't think about as trade policy actually do. In some ways, there's sort of like an inverse relationship. And so, you know, on the one hand, you have people like TPP is a great example, right? People who are pushing TPP are like, this is going to do, it's going to create all these jobs, going to do great stuff for American exports. And the people who didn't like TPP were like, oh, this is like, it's going to lead like an opening for all this the cheap stuff, and like ruin our country. And Trump was like, I'm going to do great things by not doing it. I'm going to I'm going to renegotiate a great deal with China. And like at the end of the day, like you can't see any of this stuff in sort of like the aggregate um, numbers. Like, I mean, there might be individual businesses that are better off, and like that's sort of where the trade deal stuff is interesting. Like, okay, like yeah, if you create a system where like tobacco companies basically can prevent their packaging from getting regulated in Indonesia, or like try to do that, then like obviously that's going to have an impact. And like you can see how people be annoyed about this, or like you're extending a particular kind of patent regime for pharma or whatever countries that don't have that. Like that's sort of where, but that doesn't impact like the trade balance in a meaningful way, that doesn't impact most people's living standards. Like what it affects is sort of, I mean, it might affect the profits of like the individual businesses or things like that, but that's kind of different. Whereas, what really matters is sort of like these macro factors, like what's the distribution of income, like how much money are people spending in total, or things like that. That's like, but like people don't think about that as really driving trade, even though they should.
Mm. We have a question that's sort of taking us in a different direction, but I'm interested in your perspective. How do you differentiate your theory from that of underdevelopment that older world system theorists formulated? And what do you think of Lenin's theory of imperialism, as he was also highly inspired by Hobson?
Right. So yeah, that's a question we get. Well, the first one, I confess, I don't feel like I know enough about to properly address, but the Lenin one, that's definitely because yeah, I mean, much of the reason why Hobson is famous now or still known is because Lenin, cited him, and so you have a whole like generation of people who either are Leninists or Russian historians, and they kind of draw on that. And he made several kind of important distinctions from Hobson. I mean, Hobson was not a revolutionary. Hobson was a reformer. What there are different words you can use, but I mean, his view was not that a sort of broadly speaking, capitalist market economy was inherently problematic, and he was not arguing that it would lead to some kind of like there were inevitable consequences of that system. His point was more that if you have kind of deformations and particular problems, then it leads to these weird adverse consequences that are bad, but they can be fixed. And that I think is basically where like Michael and I come out, that you don't need to overthrow society as we know it. Like we know how to do things like raise taxes and improve welfare and other stuff. Like it's not rocket science. I mean, you don't need to do it, like you don't need to be that innovative. And I think that's probably at a short version of like the biggest difference with us and Lenin. I mean, Lenin's point also is like talking about how how this stuff leads to war and things like that, which again, I don't even know if Hobson necessarily thought that it would inevitably lead to war. Obviously it was a risk. I mean, I think there's a risk as well that if you have increasing hostility between people in different countries because they think that people in other countries are the cause of their own problems, when that's not the case, like that is not helpful to international peace, as we say. But like it's different from saying that it's inevitably going to be leading to sort of a clash over the way Lenin talks about. So I think those are sort of the main differences.
Thank you. Here's another question we got. In the book's conclusion, you highlight Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin and Republican Senator Josh Hawley's Competitive Dollar for Jobs and Prosperity Act, which would tax foreign purchases of US assets with the goal of shrinking the US's current account deficit. Given that Hawley is a Koch-funded conservative masquerading as an economic populist, are there unforeseen political risks in this otherwise seemingly sound approach to monetary policy?
That's a big question. I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I don't know. Like, there's obviously a lot one can say about him and his like political career and so forth thus far, but I think this particular thing is a perfectly reasonable idea. I mean, you could argue there are other things that you could do to have sort of a similar effect. So I'm not going to like endorse a specific piece of legislation, but it seemed like the principle makes sense. I mean, the principle essentially being, if you have a lot of, you know, people in the rest of the world who are underspending and putting their money in the United States, and then as a consequence of distorting the US financial system, that then creates problems for Americans. Then if you can discourage that from happening, then simultaneously it's better for Americans and also better for the people in those other countries, because presumably the people, the elites who are, you know, basically just accumulating dollar assets might instead, do something else. They might spend at home or, pay people more or whatever. So that principle I think makes a lot of sense. I mean, again, like you could go on about other things, but I think in general that idea makes sense and be better for everyone.
Great, thank you. I guess, you mentioned this in your presentation, and I was curious if you could maybe break this down because it's something that I myself was a little bit confused about, which is, you and Michael Pettis paint America as like a kind of a victim in this trade policy story. Um, Maybe you could spell that out a little bit, talk about the exorbitant burden that you mentioned in the
Sure.
lecture.
So this is one of those things where, yeah, I mean, it always sounds weird when like we say this and people think it's kind of odd. I mean, this is like something we say in the introduction, like you take sort of Hobson's analysis, and actually this is a point that a guy named Kenneth Austin made about 10 years ago, which is that like America is basically functioning as a colony, economically from like Hobson's perspective, which sounds like a very weird thing to say. It's not saying obviously like we are literally a subject state of anyone else, but that if you think about sort of Hobson's economic model, there's some interesting similarities there. But the thing is, like, this is also where it's important to get back to sort of like the title and premise of the book, which is that thinking too much about like America as the unit of analysis is going to lead you in the wrong direction because there's some Americans who've done very, very well from this, and in fact, many like Americans who've like been actively participating in this in other societies, right? Like the extent that China suppresses workers' wages and does a bunch of other things that make it a very attractive place to produce things to the rest of the world. You have also American businesses and the owners of those businesses who are then saying, "Oh, this will be a perfect place for me to, move production out of the United States." And like they've done fantastically well. So when we talk about like America, suffering from this as a consequence, I mean, I believe we're trying to be careful. It's like it's Americans and generally like, the preponderance of Americans. Obviously, some Americans haven't having done well. And so that's sort of the point we're getting at. And the exorbitant burden you mentioned, which sort of follows on from this question about the competitive dollar act. Essentially, if you have like some random oligarch in Russia or what have you saying they want to put their money in Miami condo, then that basically makes things like that end up making the dollar more expensive than it otherwise would be. And what that does is it means that if you are anyone who makes things in the United States, then you're gonna have a hard time selling things to the rest of the world. And it also means that you're gonna have a hard time selling things to Americans if someone else in the rest of the world could sell those things at a lower price because the dollar is expensive. And so, speaking of things that people sort of overrate, like tariffs are not particularly one of the many reasons why they aren't, as if, useful or effective or whatever as people talk about or tend to think, people like Trump particularly thought about is that, exchange rates tend to move a lot. And in fact, exchange rates move all the time, usually by margins that are much bigger than like the tariffs that put on. Like, you can think about the move in the dollar between sort of the beginning of 2014 and the beginning of 2016 is like the imposition of like the rest of the world putting a 25% tariff on American goods, effectively. Like that's a big deal, and like that wasn't something like that coincided with a essentially a recession in the U.S. manufacturing sector. So like that seems like a bad thing and not something that we would want. So that's what we mean by like the exorbitant burden, and that's it's ordinary Americans who suffer from this as a consequence. Because again, the corollary here is you end up having a big increase in debt, and unless that's debt that's issued by someone that has no problem borrowing, that's going to be a real problem. Like you look at the housing debt bubble in the 2000s. I mean, that was a catastrophe for a lot of people, and it was completely necessary.
That was really helpful. Thank you. I feel like that clarified things for me. Any last questions from the chat? Going once, twice. Okay. Well, those are all the questions that I had. Matt, as a good materialist, I would be remiss not to ask where people can buy your book. I'm
Uh,
assuming where all books are sold, Amazon.
yeah, I think anywhere. I mean, I think you can buy it directly from the press as well. But yeah, you can definitely get it on Amazon, any like local the bookstore. I don't know how what bookstores are. I mean, a lot of things are closed or whatever. But yeah, any bookstore you should be able to get it from. And I know it's on Amazon and other like Barnes and Noble stuff like that. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and giving us a kind of econ lesson, which was very helpful for me. And for those coming to our event, thank you for attending. If you can make it to our general meeting on March 21st at noon, we're going to have Paul Prescott speak about the future of the American labor movement, which might be a nice complement to this discussion. So thank you again, Matt, and thanks for everyone for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye.
All right.